Samsung 840 EVO SSD. The Samsung 840 EVO SSD was once praised as a major success, thanks to its fast performance, affordable pricing, and its role in bringing solid-state drives to the mainstream market. However, after extended use, this promising product gradually turned into a technological nightmare due to a serious performance flaw. Users began to notice that old files data stored for months without being accessed were read at extremely slow speeds, sometimes taking several seconds to open instead of the near-instant response expected from an SSD. The root cause of this issue lay in the use of TLC NAND flash memory, which offers higher storage density and lower costs, but suffers from reduced long-term data stability. Over time, the electrical charges that represent stored data slowly fade, making it increasingly difficult for the controller to accurately interpret the information. As a result, the SSD must spend more time reading and correcting these weakened signals, leading to dramatic performance degradation. Samsung attempted to mitigate the problem through firmware updates that periodically refresh old data by rewriting it. But this solution functioned more like routine maintenance than a true fix to the underlying hardware limitation. Ultimately, the Samsung 840 EVO became a clear example of how even advanced technology can be constrained by physical laws and the compromises inherent in cost-focused component design. AMD Bulldozer. AMD Bulldozer, launched in 2011, is widely remembered as a technological disaster, an ambitious architectural experiment that was heavily over-engineered while losing sight of its most important goal: efficient, real-world performance. Marketed as the world's first 8-core consumer CPU, Bulldozer relied on a module design in which each module contained 2 integer cores that were forced to share a single floating point unit, meaning the processor behaved less like 8 independent cores and more like 4 pairs constantly competing for critical resources. This design flaw severely limited performance, causing Bulldozer chips to perform worse than their predecessor, Phenom II, in many games and everyday applications, while also creating serious optimization challenges for software developers. In an effort to stay competitive with Intel, AMD pushed clock speeds to extreme levels, most notably with the FX 9590 reaching 5 GHz, but this came at the cost of massive power consumption and heat output, with TDP figures soaring to 220 watts and turning the CPU into what many described as a small space heater, requiring oversized cooling solutions. Despite being a commercial and technical failure, Bulldozer ultimately played a crucial role in AMD's long-term success, as the lessons learned from this misstep forced the company to completely rethink its CPU strategy, paving the way for the highly efficient and widely acclaimed Ryzen architecture that followed. Nvidia GTX 970. The VRAM issue surrounding the Nvidia GTX 970 is widely regarded as one of the most infamous marketing and engineering controversies in graphics card history, unfolding in 2014 and quickly igniting outrage across the tech community. Nvidia advertised the GTX 970 as featuring 4 GB of VRAM, a specification clearly printed on the box and central to many consumers' purchasing decisions. In reality, however, the memory was not uniformly accessible. 3.5 GB operated at full speed, while the remaining 0.5 GB ran at significantly reduced bandwidth and much higher latency, to the point where it was often mockingly described as being useful only for moral support, when games or applications exceeded the 3.5 GB threshold. Performance dropped sharply, with frame rates plunging and noticeable stuttering, turning what should have been smooth gameplay into something resembling a PowerPoint slideshow. Independent benchmarks exposed this behavior, sparking heated discussions on tech forums and turning the nickname the 3.5 GB card into a global meme aimed squarely at Nvidia. Although the company defended the situation as an intentional design choice, the explanation failed to calm public backlash, ultimately leading to a class action lawsuit that Nvidia settled through compensation. While the GTX 970 remained a capable and competitive graphics card within its practical limits, the controversy caused lasting damage to Nvidia's reputation and stands as a cautionary tale about how misleading marketing and opaque technical decisions can permanently erode user trust. Nvidia RTX 4080 12GB. The launch of the RTX 4080 12GB in 2022 is remembered as one of the most embarrassing marketing disasters in Nvidia's history. Serious enough that the company took the unprecedented step of completely canceling a product after officially announcing it, The problem started with a confusing name. Nvidia revealed the RTX 4080 12GB alongside the RTX 4080 16GB, leading many people to believe the only difference was memory size. In reality, the 12GB model used a much smaller and weaker GPU, with fewer cores and far lower memory bandwidth, resulting in clearly lower performance. The situation became even worse when Nvidia set the price at $899, even though real-world performance was closer to what gamers would expect from a 4070 class card. Reviewers and fans quickly criticized the product, accusing Nvidia of misleading naming and overpricing. The backlash grew so strong that Nvidia publicly admitted the name was a mistake and chose to cancel the RTX 4080 12GB entirely instead of simply cutting the price. A few months later, the exact same hardware returned under a new and more honest name, RTX 4070 Ti. This rebranding helped align the product's name with its actual performance and allowed Nvidia to partially recover from a marketing mistake that could not be fixed with software updates. Rambus DRAM. Rambus DRAM was an ambitious attempt by Intel and Rambus in the early 2000s to redefine the future of computer memory, but it ultimately failed due to excessive complexity, high costs, and poor real-world practicality. One of its biggest design flaws was its serial daisy chain memory bus, often compared to a string of Christmas lights if one memory module failed or was removed. The entire system could stop working. Even stranger, motherboards using RDRAM could not have empty RAM slots. Users were forced to install special continuity modules, essentially fake RAM sticks, just to complete the circuit and allow the computer to boot. Despite being marketed as high-bandwidth memory, RDRAM suffered from high latency, meaning real performance often failed to beat much cheaper DDR memory. On top of that, RDRAM was extremely expensive, sometimes costing several times more than standard DDR while offering little to no advantage in everyday use. Heat was another major issue, as RDRAM modules ran so hot that they required large metal heat spreaders, making them look almost armored. Intel initially tried to push RDRAM as a requirement for early Pentium 4 systems, but consumers strongly rejected it due to its cost and inconvenience. By 2003, DDR memory simpler, cooler, cheaper, and more efficient had completely replaced RDRAM in the market. Intel Pentium 4 NetBurst. In the early 2000s, Intel strongly believed that higher megahertz and gigahertz automatically meant better performance. So instead of making the CPU smarter, they focused on making it run at ever higher clock speeds. To achieve this, NetBurst was designed with an extremely long instruction pipeline, up to 31 stages, allowing Pentium 4 processors to reach headline-grabbing frequencies. However, this design turned out to be deeply inefficient. Every time the CPU mispredicted a branch, the entire pipeline had to be flushed and restarted, wasting massive amounts of work. It was like sprinting up a very long staircase, only to realize you entered the wrong building and had to run all the way back down, billions of times per second, despite reaching clock speeds as high as 3.8 gigahertz. Pentium 4 chips were often beaten in real performance by slower clocked competitors, like the AMD Athlon 64, proving that raw frequency means little when much of the CPU's effort is spent correcting its own mistakes. The situation became even worse with heat and power consumption. Later Pentium 4 models, especially the Prescott core, regularly consumed over 100 watts, effectively turning the CPU into a portable space heater. In laptops, this heat output was so extreme that it could damage batteries and even cause discomfort or burns to users. Eventually, Intel was forced to abandon NetBurst entirely and pivot to the far more efficient core architecture. FireWire. Introduced in the late 1990s, FireWire was far ahead of its time, offering faster speeds, true daisy chain connectivity, and the ability to supply power directly through the cable features that clearly outclassed USB 1, and even early versions of USB 2.0. However, FireWire's biggest weakness was not its performance, but its cost. While USB was free to use and strongly backed by Intel, Microsoft, and PC manufacturers, Apple chose to charge licensing fees for every FireWire port, controller chip, and cable. This aggressive royalty policy pushed hardware makers away, as USB was cheaper, simpler, and rapidly becoming a universal standard. FireWire also gained a damaging reputation for hardware reliability issues, most notably cases where ports were physically damaged or even burned when certain devices were hot-plugged. ironically living up to its Fire name in the worst possible way. Although FireWire survived for years in a niche market, especially professional video editing, it never achieved mass adoption. Eventually, Apple phased it out entirely in favor of Thunderbolt, a successor that carried forward FireWire's high-speed philosophy without the same licensing barriers or notorious hardware failures. FireWire's story remains a powerful reminder that technical excellence alone is not enough pricing strategy. Ecosystem support and reliability can ultimately decide a technology's fate. Intel Itanium IA64. Intel Itanium IA64 was one of Intel's most ambitious failures, created to replace the x86 architecture with something the industry was not ready for. Its epic design forced compilers and programmers to manage parallel processing instead of the CPU, making software extremely difficult to write and optimize. Running existing x86 programs required slow emulation, often causing Itanium to perform worse than much cheaper Pentium processors. At the same time, Itanium systems were extremely expensive, costing thousands to tens of thousands of dollars, which discouraged adoption even in enterprise markets. Despite poor results, Intel kept the platform alive for nearly 20 years before officially ending it in 2021. The failure of Itanium shows that even powerful companies cannot push a new architecture if it is too complex, too costly, and incompatible with existing software.